Hey, how's it going? Thanks for coming out. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about confirming vision, which is the intersection between creative chaos, creative people, and user research. First, I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction about myself. We'll talk about why we want to use research as creative people in the first place, how we use it properly so we get the most out of it. I'll give you a few case studies that I've been involved with personally in the development of video games, and then we can do some Q&A after that. So first, some introductions. This is me. I've been a game designer for about 20 years, but really my whole life. I knew I wanted to do it when I was a little kid, and I want to keep doing it. I've developed a bunch of stuff, role-playing games, RTS games, lots of shooter stuff over the years, and actually a little bit of VR too, so I can answer some questions around that. Favorite games, I usually just say Halo was my favorite game, but usually when I say Ultima 4, people don't know what I'm talking about anymore because everyone's too young. And I want to keep advancing our medium because I think it's kind of the preeminent creative medium of the 21st century, so I hope many of you agree and want to do what I'm doing. So why would we use research as creative people? Obviously, like a lot of you probably follow League of Legends or mobile games, or maybe you're not even into games, you're into applications or other things where it's a lot more about understanding the user. You probably understand already why you would use research in the first place. But when I was developing this talk, it wasn't really for those people. It was more for people like this. Is anybody familiar with Undertale? Okay. So Toby probably doesn't give a shit what any of you think. He's gonna go make what he wants to make. All he cares about is his his expression to want to try and make a video game. And he could be very easily just say, I don't want to do research because who cares, and I don't want to hear the input of anybody. And I think there's a fair bit of skepticism around creative people, not just video game people, but artists, directors, musicians, or whatever. Some pretty typical skepticism is that it leads to design by committee, which everybody knows is a pejorative. Because designing by committee leads to watered down experiences, things that don't have their edge around them anymore. I think this comic does a really good job of explaining the problem that comes out of that. Hopefully. And oftentimes research can also, if it's used improperly, can lead to confirmation bias. You're trying to prove things you already know or have a bias for, or can support an agenda for somebody that want to change an experience or change a product. So those are all reasonably healthy skepticisms, but if you do things right, it's actually a lot more useful than that. So one example that creative people often use for not using research is a famous quote by Steve Jobs. So we have Bill Gates and Steve Jobs here, which kind of represent two perspectives on developing software or hardware through research. One is Microsoft's, which this was one of their taglines at one point, which is your potential, our passion, which basically means what does the customer want and need? It's really saying we don't have a point of view, it's just what do you want us to make, and we're going to make your life better. Of course, Steve Jobs famously said, people don't know what they want until you show it to them. He had no interest in market research or any other input other than what their vision was and putting it into the product. So obviously, when creative people hear that, they think, yes, that's a CEO of a major company that's been huge, and he has that point of view on research. When we were working at EA, some of those similar questions came up around research and different processes, and the then and current CEO, Andrew Wilson there, said, those are great, process is great, research is great, but the first thing I would bet on is creative people every single time. So creative people of the company obviously love that sentiment. So if a lot of people say, well, we're just going by our gut or intuition or winging it, why would we use research in the first place? And so what I would contend is that user research equals my vision's confirmed. Whether I'm making some big AAA thing, some huge product, or even if I'm making something like Undertale, through the process of testing and going out to objective external people is the only way you can guarantee that what you're making can reach the public, whether it's millions of people or your friends or whatever, in the manner in which you intended them to play it, experience it. It gives you objective methods to see if your creative vision is coming across as you intended it to. So, to preface this video, this is 3 of the most famous directors of horror. Usually when I give this speech to audiences, there's some older people in the audience, and I'm not so sure that's true anymore here. But this is a guy named John Landis, a guy named John Carpenter, and another man, David Cronenberg, talking about some of the most famous horror movies ever made, and them talking about testing them through research.
Are you ever surprised by the reactions to your films when you go in with an audience?
Oh, constantly.
Is there any particular time?
I used to think that, you know, when I was younger and more arrogant and more ignorant, certainly, I used to think the idea of
Oops.
having previews for films was really
There we go.
a bizarre, cop-out, strange industry kind of thing, and I couldn't really understand what that was about. And I later realized that there's a very good reason for it, and I realized that, you know, I used to think, well, if a poet doesn't, you know, go out and preview his poetry, but in fact I was wrong about that too, because poets always used to go out and read their poetry to audiences, and they would refine it afterwards, and for the very same reason. And you get so close to it after you worked on a picture for a year or 2 years or however long, that you begin to lose some kind of contact with it, and you have to vicariously experience it again through an audience so that you can
Having some issues here.
really see what it is. I mean, it's almost impossible. It is impossible to walk into one of your own movies, even 30 years later, I'm sure, and see it the way anybody just walking in cold would see it. You can't see it that way. Every shot has a history, every cut has a history, every actor, every prop has a history that distorts your perception of your own film. You have to see it through other eyes, and when you do that, you are constantly being surprised at reactions to things. I mean, when it works exactly the way you thought it would, that's wonderful. It's very rare.
Have either of you actually, based on a preview, changed something very strongly?
Sure.
Like, you could tell me a story.
The Fog.
What
The Fog. I showed it to a bunch of people, and they didn't react the way I wanted them to. So I changed it.
Is that you shot some additional footage that was harder?
Quick.
I actually
away.
moved the exploding head in scanners 10 minutes into the film. It was originally 2 minutes into the film.
It was the first scene.
Right.
And based on audience reaction to that, and the general pacing of the film, the rhythm of the film, I realized it was wrong, but I couldn't tell.
What's
Just
the biggest
watching this film.
surprise?
So if that's not enough convincing that artistic people should be testing with audiences, the next clip I'll show you, one more, is one of the most famous artists of the 21st century, or 20th century, talking about doing the same thing.
So from my standpoint, being an artist, I like to see what the new construction is between artist and audience. There is a breakdown. There's a personified, I think, by the rave culture of the last few years, where the audience is at least as important as whoever is playing at the rave. It's almost like the artist is to accompany the audience and what the audience are doing. And that feeling is very much permeating music.
So there's a couple of examples there, but you know, there's lots of artists who also test in public. Bands test to make sure their material is great before they record it. DJs are constantly having the interaction with the audience and testing how they develop their set to try and get people as engaged with it as possible. And obviously comedians are always testing the material as well. So it's not something that is unusual to big video games. Halo's been doing user research with Microsoft for 20 years, and Bungie will contend that it's a essential part of what developed that series in the first place, was the research methodology, and Call of Duty does it as well, a whole lot. Left 4 Dead famously did a lot of testing to develop their director system, sort of measure the experience of flow. So that was kind of the innovation there, was to feel how is the participant, how can we measure that they are actually feeling some anxiety or engagement? And actually, as part of their user research methodology, they found that sweat was the best predictor of whether or not people were engaged in the flow at that point. Battlefield 4 is a good example of directly engaging the community. Battlefield 4, when it launched, was kind of a disaster because the networking didn't work. And so it took them a year to get it back to where it was sort of in positive territory with the perception of the community. And one of the ways they did was they actually engaged what they called influencers at the time, not the same thing, but they essentially did the same thing, which is that they played the product in the DLC that would come through, and then we get the beta test it, give them feedback, and then some of that feedback would get incorporated into the builds, and then they would go out and talk about it. So it was kind of a direct audience to developer relationship. Minecraft, of course, famously was just in beta forever and went out by word of mouth and was being developed on the fly for many, many years. Riot directly involves data analytics people in the actual creative teams that build it, so they know moment to moment actually what's happening with the game, so they can better inform creative decisions on what they're trying to do to evolve League of Legends. Of course, mobile games are all built on understanding kind of the moment to moment of everything that's happening in their service. And so they can sort of build and understand the research of what's happening on their product. Another reason you use research is that you can have more objective, productive conversations with the people you're working with or the team. A lot of times when you have an argument about one thing or another, you can get into these sort of cyclical things where someone has an opinion about one thing and the other, and it's subjective. And if you use research where you can say, here's what I think, here is the audience perception of this right now, or here is how people are actually experiencing this, then you can change the conversation and have a more productive one. So, let's say we're putting something together and they say players are going to really hate this. The game is too difficult right now is a pretty popular one, or the game is too easy from another person on the team. I think they'll understand this thing we're trying to teach them. These are all subjective opinions. What would be really great is just to have actual data that says how are people actually understanding or perceiving this right now. Because we as creative people are not objective. We're too close to it. We need to have external people test what we're doing to understand. So how do we use it properly as creative people? One thing we can do is we can save time before research by applying design principles and psychology. Now, video games is still a pretty new medium, and there isn't kind of a hero's journey or kind of a lot of things where we say these are absolute principles that you uphold yet, but there are design principles just from design in general that we can apply to a lot of things that help us not waste time in research. We can already take care of some things we know will be problematic if we apply some of these things. I'm just using a few examples to show you how you can apply them to anything creative you'll be working on, but there are others, and they can help you not burn time in like testing around things where there's already maybe a better way to approach it through design principles. So accessibility, I'm sure you've heard of before, which is how do we make the experience of something accessible to everyone. A pretty famous example of this is Halo. Before Halo came onto video game consoles, the idea of playing a first-person shooter on a controller was unheard of. Mouse, keyboard, why would I do anything else? And so what's happening under the hood here, for example, is there is a lot of code underneath getting the bullet to where it needs to go to, keeping your character aligned with what you're trying to strafe around, trying to assist you with what you're aiming at, and trying to make it as invisible as possible because we want you to think you're really good. You are good, but you're also being helped a little bit invisibly through a system that's helping everyone play this better than if they just had raw input. Relatability. If you create something and you're not drawing upon the human experience and you just create something alien or weird, people go like, I have no idea what the hell that is, right? But if you can blend something that's strange with something that's sort of in the human experience or a human mental model, oftentimes they will still think it's new, but it'll feel real to them. They'll have some resonance. So, for example, what do you think is the most successful movie of the 20th century? Anybody? Movie most people saw it, or Money, or Famous. Those are all correct. Yeah. How about Star Wars? Star Wars count? Okay. So Star Wars, a lot of people use an example of like, well, why would I want to make something that's just like anything else? Like, for example, a pretty common sort of creative and oftentimes a marketing technique is to go, If you blend X with Y, you get this, and people, oftentimes creative people don't like that because they're like, well, I'm just taking these two things that everybody knows about, and that's not original, right? I'm like, well, this is something that lots of people find beloved, or did, and creative, and no one said that about this. They didn't say that wasn't original, but in truth, if you've studied this, none of Star Wars is original. So like all of the trench shots and Death Star stuff is all taken from the Dam Busters from 1955. That's why it looks like a big dogfight. Here's Kurosawa's Hidden Fortress. What does that look like? Right? Yojimbo, also from Kurosawa. I'm sure you know where that reference is going. And it's just littered with this. And so basically what George Lucas did was take a lot of things that were out there in popular culture that he loved and he knew people would relate to, and made a fantasy layer on top of it that then made it so that people comprehended it. Affordance, a pretty classic design principle. This teapot affords the capacity to pick it up, right? If you build things, build user interactions, you build gameplay mechanics so that the mechanic itself, the feature, affords an action. It sort of already communicates to the person that it does this thing, then their intuition on how to use it will be easier, and their comprehension and time to start playing will be faster. So for example, this cat probably doesn't afford being a gun, no matter how he wants to try it. But a gun that I developed for Halo 4 looks like a shotgun, right? So it probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense why in the future we're using shotguns. But if you've played Halo, if you played Call of Duty, if you played Destiny, if you've played Apex Legends, you'll notice that everything that's science fiction is still using pretty traditional guns. And the reason for that is because when we do user research, and every time somebody builds a gun that's a little weird and it looks a little different than what people are used to, their knowledge, their use of that thing goes down, and they don't understand how to use it, and they like it less. So again, to the familiarity and the affordance, it helps us to build certain things so that players have models for them so they know how to use them right away. Which also gets into another design concept, which is, sorry, I skipped my own slide. This is an experience I built, helped the team build for Oculus that starts off the touch controllers. If anybody's worked in VR before, you'll know that affordance is a huge deal, because when you're in VR, anything, whereas like players will accept in sort of outside of like sort of traditional 2D experiences that there are some things they can and can't interact with. In VR, that all goes away. So like if you're in here in this experience and you can't interact with something that looks like it should be interactable, immersion's broken, they don't want to play VR ever again. Verisimilitude. It's kind of a fancy word that means it feels right. This is something that feels like it should be the thing it is. I'm sure you remember the Wii controller. The reason why Nintendo built it this way is because there was a lot of research that showed that there was a lot of people out there who wanted to play video games, but they found modern controllers and experiences complicated, weird. So they said, okay, well, we'll give you something that you're used to. A remote control. Everyone's played one of those. And so they kind of brilliantly solved the problem around accessibility, intuition, all the other design principles we've been talking about. Because when you don't design with this in mind, you can end up with some weird examples. Anybody remember this? Like that game controller? This is a very old game controller. Can you imagine shooting with that? Right? Versus our modern day controllers, which look like this. And the reason why they look like that is because that feels like that. And when I'm pulling the trigger and aiming down a gun and hitting something, the whole experience feels right. It feels like exactly what you're supposed to experience out of that, and the user feels better about it. And last, this is kind of a fancy term that actually somebody in my company came up with some time ago. It's a ludonarrative dissonance. And what this means is the further you get away, the player's experience gets away from the narrative that's in the experience, the less immersive it is, the more you kind of sort of check out from the experience. So from our products, Assassin's Creed has a good example of this being right, or not having ludonarrative dissonance, because the whole fantasy is around being an assassin, and everything you do in the experience as an assassin, every way that you play is about being that assassin that keeps that fantasy intact, and so people don't lose immersion. Versus something else that I worked on was a game called Battlefield Hardline, and it was Battlefield meets cops and robbers. And so when I say cops and robbers, you think cops, and you have a fantasy in your head about this. Actually, the American fantasy is these guys walking down the street, beat cops, eating donuts and getting fat. But what we had in the game when we first sort of announced it looked like this. And so we have strong ludonarrative dissonance because people don't think of cops as like wielding assault rifles and mowing people down and getting kill streaks. So we had to revisit that. So those were some design principles. Those are not all that you could apply, but if you apply some of those, you make the experience of people getting to what you want easier. Because if you don't apply those principles, oftentimes you're going to have those same headaches because you're going to be getting in the way of your own vision for things. Another thing you can apply to psychology is just what can you study to your experience that helps people sort of understand it or understands the human mind a little bit better. For example, when people talk about a whole lot of choice in things, there's a famous book around this called Paradox of Choice, which says the more choice people have, the more confused they get or the more anxiety they have around their decisions. There's a lot of psychology that goes into cheating and how we think about, why people cheat and how we can prevent against it. So the more that we can bring in psychology to understand how people think and interact with things, the easier we can make our experience of building, and it's another thing we don't necessarily have to put as much research into. So let's assume we've done all of that. Another thing we need to do to use research properly is to know what we want to learn ahead of time. We can't just go into research and say, hey, tell us what you think and see players play it, and is it fun? Usually we're trying to think about something very specific that we want to get out of it. Otherwise, we can hook up all of the mining and data we can get out of it and have telemetry and have a lot of people dedicated to us to give us a lot of information, but it'll oftentimes come back like this because we won't know what we're looking for. So it's like, great, we have a lot, but we have no idea what it is. So instead, if we can ask questions like these, like, can players control the character like they expect to? What percentage of players picked up the placed weapon that we placed? Where are players likely to die? We use those for heat maps usually. What is the average kill-death ratio of players who favor the SMG? Kill-to-death ratio, for those who don't know, is how many kills to deaths do I have? It's a measure of how good you are in a game. And so on. And so these are just examples of things that we would want to know from research around the current version of our game we're trying to test. And then we can get much more useful information from there about how do we iterate and improve on what we're doing. Don't confuse market research with user research. User research is the user research, an iteration around the thing we're making now. We want to test and see if our creative idea comes through to them. There's no market research necessarily informing that. Usually when people think about research informing a product or a creative thing in a negative way, it's usually through market research when they think, well, let's go ask a lot of people what they want, and of course they don't know, and they go, well, here, have this vanilla thing, and then people don't want that. So those two things are not the same thing. User research is testing it, the thing that you're doing now to make sure it works. Example, here's an example of market research we did for Halo, which basically said, hey, I play it for the story, or I'd like to see games without the chief, et cetera. We're just trying to learn how people are thinking about the experience, but doesn't necessarily inform creatively what we're making. Oftentimes the market research do really large quantitative studies of people to also learn how sort of users are perceiving products, but again, not informing the right now necessarily. User research, just to give you an example, some of the tools that are part of the user research experience. This is the Microsoft User Research Labs. At the time, I think there was 5 or 6 of these where we could bring in 24, 36 people at a time to play a multiplayer or play different experiences and observe them. Observations are a really important part of what we do. We just watch how people are playing and see their trends and see how they're experiencing the game that we're making at that time. This is what's known as a heat map. So this is a multiplayer level in a first-person shooter where people are dying all over the place. That's the red. So we can see where people are getting killed in the level. Same thing, only this is how fast are they progressing through a level, so we can visualize, people are getting here in 10 minutes, in 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, et cetera. There's survey, so we have data. We also want to know what people are actually thinking, and so they can tell us during the research that we're doing with them. We have eye tracking that we can do, measure heart and sweat like we were talking about earlier. Importantly, research is not going to design your game for you, obviously. Just in case you're wondering, anybody who does this is doing it wrong, because even The Simpsons makes fun of this. It's just not the way to lead to an inspired creative thing. you know, if we were trying to do that, you know, for Halo, for example, a good example of a UX thing they did was they famously moved to only 2 weapons. So you can only use 2 weapons at a time. And one of the main reasons they did that was to simplify input on the controller, because before that on a PC, you could have all weapons. So if you were to ask the players at that time, how many weapons should you carry? They would say all of them, and customize them, and unlimited ammo, and everything else, right? And then you end up with this. So if you're out, you know, like you can't have it, you're the creative person, you're designing the experience, you have the experience. The point is for you to put your thoughts and your experience and your vision into things and use the user research as the way to confirm it and see how you can get better to expressing your ideas. Set expectations. Just because it works in user research does not mean it's going to be a success, because otherwise we would all make this. And every one of us, for making a video game, would have that kind of success. But you never quite know how things are going to go out and get perceived when they go out on the market. Maybe they did, but. And lastly, it helps to use an accredited external research team. That could be in a company, that could be a third party. If you don't have the resources for that, that could just be an external people, someone's, your friends, whatever. The point is to get to the least sort of biased people possible to play what you have, so that they can give you real objective feedback that isn't going to be noisy in any way. Like I said before, creators are not objective. So it helps you to have that feedback from people who don't have anything in the experience, no skin in the game. There are experts, we have one of them here, trained to do this. So here's a case study from something that I worked on a while ago, which was Halo 4. We had jetpacks in that game. And when we first introduced them on the dev team, it's really cool fantasy. Obviously, fly around with a jet. They do that in Destiny, and also Anthem's coming out soon that has a bunch of jetpack stuff in it. But the thing that our team was concerned about, at least some people on our team was, is they felt like people with jetpacks would dominate everybody in multiplayer because you have a vertical advantage to everything with a gun. They thought this would happen. If you use jetpacks, then your kills to deaths would go way up. So anybody with skill would dominate everybody else, because it's obvious. If you're skilled and now you're shooting someone in the face from above and they don't know what's going on, and you're using that to your advantage. However, through our data mining, we found the opposite was true. Anyone who picked up a jetpack, or statistically, most people picked up a jetpack, their kill-death ratio went down. Anybody want to guess why? Sorry? Look up? Okay. It's because you have, and part of the way we design it is because you have very little control. And he has lots of control. And so this person becomes a sitting duck to anyone who's skilled rather than skilled and above. So the point being is that we used research, per my point earlier about having objective, informed conversations around what we should do. This is one where we could use research and data to say, hey, I know it's counterintuitive, but the reality is different than what you think. Another example of something that I worked on was this feature in Battlefield Hardline called Freeze. So when we introduced it, Freeze was basically you put your badge up and you tell someone not to move. And so in theory, this was a great feature because there's nothing more cop fantasy than that, telling someone to freeze. It incorporated the gun, so your user experience didn't change. You just put the badge up and you use the same controls that you would on the sticks as you would with a gun, so people should know how to use it already. In theory, there's nothing more perfect for it. Also, that game, Battlefield Hardline, you can play 80% of that campaign without ever shooting your weapon, which is crazy when you think about what kind of Battlefield game, or what kind of game Battlefield is. So it was a kind of a new feature that we put into the thing. So we're like, great. So the team starts playing it, and everyone from the quality assurance group to the team to VPs are like, this is the greatest thing for first-person shooters ever. Awesome. Okay, and we put it, oh, here's an example of an early version of it. And so actually I'm showing you this because you could also have a feature where you could put your hands up. So instead of like you saying someone to freeze, they could tell you to freeze, and then you had some options on how you sort of diffuse the situation. So great. Everyone's playing it, and then we put it into user research, and we find something interesting. When people start playing it, people don't care. They're like, why would I do this? Because why don't you just shoot them? That's easier. And putting your hands up gets you killed, like in that version of where they use freeze against you. So we're like, oh, okay, that sucks. So we realized with the put your hands up version, people were not comprehending this to begin with. Like, you know, they said, this is very counterintuitive to what I think I would do as a cop. And I use it like twice, and then I just chop people up anyway. So I'm like, when we think about how we measure success, I oftentimes think about it in these three buckets, which is, do they comprehend the thing I'm trying to do to begin with? Do they use it through the whole experience over and over again? And do they enjoy it? Do they think it's a fun thing? And in the case of the sort of the second version where you're putting your hands up, people didn't even comprehend it, so whatever, cut it. So it made it very easy for us to just, you know, get rid of that very easy and focus our development elsewhere. But we still had this version, which we believed in. We just believed that we didn't have the right version of it yet. So we built research into our process a lot more tightly than we had before. And so first we have a plan, you know, based on our design assumptions. We do design around that. We say, okay, people aren't using this feature the way we want them to. Why is that right now? What have we observed through research that tells us why they're not using it? Do they not comprehend when they can? Do they not think it's good? Is it not useful, et cetera? We make some decisions. We implement, play test, see if it makes sense to us, put it back into research, see if we improved, et cetera, and just keep doing this loop until the feature works in the way we intend it to, or we know this isn't going to work over time and we cut it. That's a way that I like working. So with this particular feature, this freeze, some of the things that we did this was over a 6-month period of time, using that sort of cycle, is we identified things like they didn't know who they could freeze. And one of the reasons they didn't know is because at that time, we were trying to do a completely immersive, diegetic version of this, where instead of throwing user interface or any kind of other indicator on the screen, we would just try and do it through animation and state and sort of have that communicate who could be subjected to this freeze. And players just didn't understand that or when they would perceive it. So we decided at that point to just throw the user interface and say, you can freeze this guy now. It's less elegant, but user interface always works because it says, here's what you do. Another thing we did was we were also getting some sort of mixed feedback on our partner AI, which is the woman over there. Players, it's always a tricky thing with partner AI and campaigns. You know, oftentimes people think they're not useful or they do silly things. That's why oftentimes, I mean, the best in class thing we have is Ellie from Last of Us. And even she's kind of usually, she gets away with something because she gets to be under Joel a lot. So oftentimes the AI, we don't want them violating how you want to do something. So oftentimes we're kind of in a tricky situation about trying to make them feel like they're actually real living things that are part of the experience you're building. With this freeze feature, we found we were able to actually incorporate the partner very directly, because what would happen is as soon as you did that freeze and then you handcuff somebody, you'll see it in a video I'll play. We'll tilt the camera down, and then wherever the partner happens to be, she ends up teleporting. And then she's right there to protect whoever, or basically get involved with the freeze. So now players are like, oh, partner's really helpful in this freeze thing. That's cool. And then another thing we did, which is like a guaranteed thing that will usually work in just about every experience, no matter how counterintuitive, is metagame. Metagame will not dramatically improve an intrinsically bad experience, but it will definitely force multiply one that they buy into, even if it doesn't make immediate sense. And what I mean here is that we're giving you 250 points for arresting somebody with this feature. You use most of your points in getting guns. So that doesn't make any sense, right? It's like basically I'm arresting people to get this thing that I don't use. Doesn't matter, people still did it a whole lot. So we do all of these things and more. And so here's the final version of this feature.
Tell these guys to freeze.
Freeze!
I'll back you up.
The guy's shooting up the place. Who are they?
I don't know. I think it's the same cycles hit.
Fucking cop. Kai!
Got your back, Nick.
So after we do all of that, players all understand how to use it now. Players kept using it through the entire campaign in our final tests, and people wanted to use it, unlike their first test where nobody wanted to use it. So We wouldn't have gotten that result if we hadn't tested the hell out of this thing and iterated it over and over and over again. One more case study is we had called mode discovery in Halo 4. This is a pretty fast one. So post research, and actually using some market research in this case, we found that the number of people playing our Spartan Ops mode was low. Spartan Ops was a PvE episodic content thing we introduced along with the main game. So, well, why is this low? We don't understand. Because it tested really well during development. People really liked the idea of this. And when we asked them in market research after the game's launched, everyone thinks very favorably. They're like, oh yeah, I would like to do that. It sounds really cool. Even to those of them who owned the game. So some owners don't even know they have it. And this is an example of something really, that seems like really simple, but then we're sort of not even dissuaded, just confused people to not even play this mode, was that unlike the previous Halo games, this was always usually very functional in the previous ones. It would say campaign, multiplayer, force, theater. We did this push around Halo 4 to contextualize all the multiplayer. And so now you see we have War Games, Spartan Ops, Forge and Theater is still the same. A lot of people thought that Spartan Ops thing was like viewing the character or something, not like a game mode. So we were hurting ourselves from our menu, which sounds crazy, but you'd be surprised how often this happens. Good example is, here's Madden 25. When this got introduced, there was a big concern from the community and some drop-off because a lot of people felt like they had to play multiplayer. And it turns out through research, a lot of people who play Madden don't want to play multiplayer. They're misanthropes. They don't want to play with other people. We're like, why? Well, no, you don't have to play multiplayer. We say it right here. It's play online or offline as a owner, coach, or player. It's right there. And all the people saw was connected franchise. So they thought, oh, connected all the time, I'm playing multiplayer. So just in the wordage that's there, you have a ton of the community who's just like, I don't know, this is the same experience I was building. So again, through research, might have caught that going out early. So in closing, confirm your design. User research can be very useful for almost every creative endeavor. It doesn't have to be a big AAA thing or a mobile thing or an application. It can be your own independent project. It can be your own sort of more emotional art project. It's still super useful. It helps you experience see your experience with the eyes of the audience, sort of see if your creativity and your vision is going to come through. It makes your conversations and decisions easier because you have less things that are subjective and you can have conversations about things that we know as fact. It highlights problems that are not immediately apparent. A lot of times things like I was describing the jetpack are counterintuitive, and it really takes research to understand where your problem is. And it's more effective when you use principles, know what you want out of it, what you want to try and learn, and you use external experts and participants so you get the most objective viewpoint possible. And most importantly, me speaking as someone who, my end game is to go off and make creative things without teams and whatever, just make things by myself. It does not compromise your vision. I know it. And that's it. I'll take questions. Yes.
Okay. Hello.
Hey.
So with everything you said about using user research to figure out what players are familiar with and what they're not, don't you feel that in some way that sort of hinders the creativity of it? Because like you gave Undertale as an example when you were saying this, and the reason why Undertale and a lot of other small indie games work is because they try something new. When somebody plays Undertale for the first time, it's very counterintuitive of them, having played RPGs in the past, to, for example, not kill every enemy encounter that you have.
Yes. So if I'm rephrasing your question properly, it's that it was actually one of the things I mentioned there is like in user research, if you're testing against some brand new, then they're not going to have any mental model for that. And couldn't that, if I'm getting your question correctly, couldn't that compromise your vision?
Yes.
No, it doesn't have to. And so the reason why is that all you care about is that people are playing it how you want them to. And so if your intention is that people play Undertale and they don't kill anything, then that should be true. And if they're playing your experience and they are killing things or they're killing more of them, why not? Or why is that happening? And so all you have to understand as the creative person is like, my vision is that people don't kill anybody in here, but they are. That's bad. So now all I have to do with that information is go, right now, there's a reason why this is happening in the way I don't intend. What do I do about it? That's how I look at the research.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any more questions?
First of all, thank you for coming and sharing your inputs about user research. When you are researching, how do you go about when the information the users give you is contradictory? Like some of the information tells you you should have some feature, but the same information from other players is telling you you should not have that same feature. How do you go about it? Because it is possible for the information you get from the research to not help you or not give you the development you are expecting, right?
You mean in the case where we have some people who do have the feature and some who don't?
Both go through the same experience, but in the end, some players get the idea that what they experienced right now was bad, but others experience that it was great.
Oh, I see. Well, when it comes to sentiment, obviously we want people to have a good experience with what they're doing. And so that's sort of a global thing that sort of covers every part of the development process. And really, that's something where the creative idea that I'm putting together has to resonate with I'm trying to reach as many people as I can. Sometimes when people build projects, they're looking at a particular audience. So like, it doesn't necessarily have to be like a big, huge project. It could be like, the guy who's making Stardew Valley really doesn't care that it's, a shoot like he's going to appeal to the shooter person or the League of Legends person. He wants to appeal to the Harvest Moon person, and that's because that's who he is. So he may not care whether it appeals to everybody. All he cares is that particular person is someone that is really resonant with. When it's a big AAA project, there's a big one. Usually, they think about that in terms of personas, which is to say, who do we think will like this? So, like for example, EA used to have this notion of captains and bards and cowboys, and they kind of were sort of these cute names that were identified with people who like to either have strategic control or liked storytelling or liked sort of more of like a strategic layer on things. And so you might say, well, in building this experience, I'm really interested in this particular person. And in that case, then your user research, if you're trying to measure that kind of sentiment, becomes a little bit more focused, because you're just saying, well, all I'm trying to do is appeal to this certain kind of person. Therefore, if the person who really likes storytelling does not like my, Apex Legends game, I don't care as much. So if you want to bring that consideration into sort of your research and your testing around how you're building something, then that's fine. But it's really, when it's coming to someone's personal project, it's really just, what is it they're trying to express, and is it coming through, like our previous question, in the way that you intended?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hello.
Hi.
I would ask you to tell me what is the difference in time when you are doing stuff like the freeze stuff we were talking about, that you put in the user interface an icon saying you can freeze them, or finding another way to tell the user they can actually freeze them. You said that the user didn't actually at the beginning how to use that functionality, but I would like to know how much time do you need to do it well without putting a user interface to be more immersive?
Sure, yeah. These are always interesting decisions for people, because some people are under time pressure and duress, which I was. I had basically 6 months to do this in. And we were trying to fix a project where, like I was saying earlier in that presentation, the initial reaction to it was, oh, this isn't the fantasy I was expecting, and we had to very quickly put fantasy in there. And so sometimes we're under time pressure. Sometimes you have all the time in the world to develop something, and that's really just, okay, is it ever coming through in the way we want it to? Like, I don't know if the developers of Inside did testing, but they took 8 years to build their experience, and maybe part of that was, is this really coming through how we want it to? Is this really being expressed the way we want it to? In the case where we have time pressure, it really just comes down to priorities, which is to say, like, do we think that the time that we have, we're going to be able to, develop the things that we have? And that kind of gets into another talk of, the best way to be able to measure that is if you have a production process where you're able to measure some aspects of how you're able to build. So if you know how long it takes to make an asset, or how long it takes to implement something in code, then there's some of that you can answer. You can say, okay, well, I want to be able to put this UI layer on top of everything instead of doing all of the sort of in-game animation work around it. Do we have the UI artists to do that, the engineers to do it? Does the tool set allow us to do it? You have all of those inputs into your production process that allow you to make an informed decision based on your time. So that's the way we did it there. And that's the way we try and measure those kind of decisions when we're up against time pressure. In the case where you don't have time pressure, then it's really just, well, at some point you're going to put this out and you want people to experience it, then you have all the time in your world. But it's really at that point a question of, like, do I ever think this will work? I need to make a judgment call on that.
Hi.
Hi.
Again, thank you for coming and for the talk. I wanted to ask you, what do you actually do when you have, like, when your vision goes against what the user wants or what the majority of user wants? For example, if you're taking the Celeste game, and one of their problems was the accessibility of the game because it was too hard, so they implemented what we call the assist mode. So it was kind of a compromise, but I think they even write it when you turn on the assist mode. It's not the intentioned way you want to play the game, but they deliver it to you nonetheless. How do you tackle these kinds of problems yourself?
Sure. This one depends on your goal. So for example, not to use Celeste as an example, but I often say that, if you go with me here, Dark Souls Bloodborne as a game is similar to Animal Crossing. And what I mean by that is that neither of them compromise. At least the original Animal Crossing didn't. They don't compromise in the sense that Bloodborne and Dark Souls and Demon Souls up front tell you you're going to die. You're going to die a lot. And you better just get used to dying because it's going to happen. And they make a contract with you to know what you're getting into. But players are okay with it because they know that up front and they know that it's fair. They know that they can learn these things, they can improve, and they feel great about it when they do improve. The reason why this is similar to Animal Crossing is if you remember from playing the original one, Animal Crossing said to you, people are going to bed tonight, so no more content for you. Too bad, shut it off. Unless you game the system and open the time clock, whatever. But most people didn't do that. They accepted the reality of the simulation and said, okay, all right, I can't do that thing right now. They were up front with you. Here's the universe. It makes sense to you. And what it's doing essentially is it's making you feel like it's real, right? So something that Celeste could have done is said, one of our things that we do around this is it's really hard. And that's just the way it is. And they made a creative decision to allow people to help it because they determined that wasn't as important in whatever they were trying to sort of communicate about their vision. Now with big games, ones that like, sell in the Call of Duty or even Fortnite range, for those, oftentimes they're trying to make them as accessible as possible. So they're trying to smooth off some of those edges and try and sort of make it so that people, they're either making things so they're more accessible for the user, or they're listening to the community, which is to say, okay, well, our vision for this thing was X, but now the community is really getting like excited about like this kind of thing they've built within inside the game, or this different way that they're playing it. How do we support that? And so, that could be, you're either sort of preemptively trying to make it so that you're supporting a community and making it accessible for them, or you are directly listening to them because it's important, because your game is a service or something, that you're listening to people and that you're making decisions that help, that basically are talking to them and having them involved, so that they feel like the game is sort of responding to the way that the community is liking to play something. So it kind of depends on the sort of problem you're trying to solve with that. You can go either ways, but those are a few examples.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any more questions?
Hi, I wanted to ask you, how do you feel that the inertia from other games of the same genre affect you and your vision when developing a game of the same genre? And I'm thinking about, like, for instance, talk about Apex Legends, and it has a lot of features that came from other games like H1Z1, Fortnite, the sorts.
Well, so it could be inspiration. Like I love, like for example, I don't know if anybody played Halo 4 here, but like there's a big, there's a big Metroid Prime influence because I think Metroid Prime is awesome. So I wanted to put as much of that as I could into it. And we hired a lot of people from the company that made it. So now as far as like, sometimes your consideration around AAA games or big games is what features can I borrow because they're accessible to people. So to use Halo as an example, again, one problem that we had at the time is that Halo, famously on its controls, had shooting on the right trigger and grenades on the left trigger. And Halo used to be the big first-person shooter. Then Call of Duty in 2007-ish became the big first-person shooter, and it moved everything to aim down sights. So you push the left trigger, and now people are aiming the gun rather than throwing a grenade. We put this into research, and of course, a big chunk of the people that we were testing with, instead of, aiming the gun how they wanted to, they're throwing grenades because it's an old model, right? So we had a lot of debate internally about that, and we decided to keep our old model because we felt like we still needed to differentiate what we were doing from what they were doing, because in that game we're doing a whole lot of this aiming down the sight. We felt that slowed things down compared to what Halo was, which was a lot more kind of frenetic and run and gun, and we knew that would be a design decision that would change things. So that was a case where we looked at something, we thought this is the way things are going, it's great, it's a good experience, there's nothing wrong with this, except that for our particular experience, this may not be where we want to go with it. So they probably made very similar considerations with Apex and Fortnite and everything else.
Thank you.
Okay, we have time for one last question.
Hey, I was wondering, how globalized is your market research? Like, do you just target American culture? Do you target other cultures? How do you decide upon how you're going to do your research regarding users?
Well, so for market research, it's global, and it starts there. We're trying to understand the entirety of the global market, and our tools for release tools at big companies, my company for sure, are very good at being able to sort of not only see the global picture of things in real time and how we would want to try and measure against the kind of people who would be interested in what we're doing. For user research, it's a little bit more complicated because you try to want to get the most broad, like if you see your target is North America and Europe, still you're trying to find like the sort of best sample set of those people. And so oftentimes the best we can do is kind of go to different sort of different markets. We'll go to Los Angeles and London, Paris, Cologne, et cetera, and try and get people from those areas and try and test and then put that information together. Sometimes that's not financially viable, so we'll just have to do everything in, kind of locally, which isn't as, good a set, but it's still testing the game, so that's good for us. We found that some cities are good cross sections for this. Like for example, Las Vegas is a really good place to test or do market research because you have so many people in the world coming to this place that are from different areas and interested in testing. So when it comes to user research, even with a major effort like the Microsoft ones, still oftentimes it's sort of local bodies that are coming into that. You still have to accept that anybody who comes in the door wanting to play for a little while with the compensation of their time and like maybe a game or something still is a pretty often hardcore person, but we're testing regardless and trying to still sort of get the information we need in order to improve our product.
Okay, let's wrap this up and give a big round of applause for Scott Warner, please.